Welcome to the A Push broadcast, where we break down the biggest moments in American history. I'm Ryan.
And I'm Dad. Today we're diving into President Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society, one of the most ambitious domestic programs in U.S. history. But before we get into that, let's set the stage with the Civil Rights Movement.
Great idea, Dad. By the early 1960s, the Civil Rights Movement had gained momentum. Activists were fighting against racial segregation and discrimination, leading to landmark moments like the Montgomery bus boycott, the March on Washington, and the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
Right. And after President John F. Kennedy's assassination in 1963, his successor, Lyndon B. Johnson, took up the fight for civil rights and much more. He pushed through legislation to reshape American society, coining his vision as the Great Society.
The Great Society aimed to eliminate poverty and racial injustice. It led to major policies in education, healthcare, and social welfare. Dad, let's break down some key programs.
Absolutely. One of the biggest achievements was Medicare and Medicaid, which provided health care for elderly and low-income individuals. These programs still exist today and help millions of Americans.
Then there was the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which increased federal funding for schools, especially those in low-income areas. Johnson believed that education was key to breaking the cycle of poverty.
And let's not forget about urban development and housing programs. The Great Society created the Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, to address issues like urban decay and affordable housing.
Another major focus was civil rights. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 outlawed discriminatory practices like literacy tests, ensuring African Americans could exercise their right to vote as well.
But as ambitious as it was, the Great Society had mixed results. It made huge strides in reducing poverty and increasing access to healthcare and education. However, some critics argue that it expanded to government too much and led to unintended consequences, like increased federal spending.
That's true. And by the late 1960s, the Vietnam War was draining resources, making it harder to fully fund these programs. Some reforms didn't have the long-term impact Johnson envisioned.
And speaking of the Vietnam War, let's talk about how it overshadowed domestic issues. Johnson was so focused on military strategy and war efforts that he lost sight of growing problems at home. One key example was the 1967 Detroit riot.
That's right. The Detroit riot, also known as the Street Riot, was one of the most destructive civil disturbances in U.S. history, sparked by tensions between African American communities and law enforcement. The riot lasted for 5 days, leaving 43 people dead and thousands injured. Instead of addressing the root causes of urban unrest, Johnson was increasingly caught up in Vietnam.
And because of this, many of his Great Society programs suffered. The war drained federal resources, and his administration struggled to deal with rising racial tensions and economic inequality. Johnson's failure to respond effectively to the Detroit crisis showed how the war diverted attention from urgent domestic issues.
Some historians argue that if Johnson had been less preoccupied with Vietnam, he could have done more to prevent urban decay and unrest. The Great Society had potential, but with divided priorities, its impact was limited in some areas.
Despite these challenges, one thing was clear: the civil rights movement continued pushing forward. Even as Johnson's attention wavered, activists kept fighting for equality, leading to further milestones like the Fair Housing Act of 1968.
Exactly. The civil rights movement didn't stop with the Great Society. It carried on, paving the way for future generations to continue the struggle for justice and equality.
And that's a reminder that it doesn't just real change doesn't just happen overnight. It takes persistence and dedication. And that's all for today's breakdown from Ryan and I.